In the late summer of 479 BC, the fate of the Western world did not hang on the words of philosophers or the votes of politicians, but on the brutal, grinding reality of thirst. Under the relentless glare of the Boeotian sun, the earth was baked hard as iron. The air shimmered with heat, distorting the horizon where the destiny of Greece was waiting to be decided. For 11 days, two massive armies had sat motionless, staring at one another across the banks of the Asopus River. To the north lay the Persian Empire, a terrifying machine of conquest that had swallowed the known world from the Indus to the Aegean. To the south, clinging to the rocky foothills of Mount Cithaeron, stood the fragile alliance of Greek city-states. They were outnumbered, they were terrified, and they were beginning to die of thirst. This was not a battle of glory, it was a stare-down. On the flat plains below, the Persian commander Mardonius had built a city of wood. His fortified camp stretched for miles, a square stockade filled with smoke from 10,000 cooking fires housing an army of subject nations. There were Medes in trousers, Bactrians with strange bows, and the elite immortals in their scale armour. They had the numbers, they had the gold, and crucially, they had the cavalry. Mardonius, the general left behind by King Xerxes to finish the job, sat on his white horse and waited. He knew the terrain was his ally. If the Greeks came down from the hills onto the flat ground, his horsemen would ride them down like grass. High above on the ridges, the Spartan regent Pausanias looked down at the sprawling enemy host. He was not a king, but he commanded kings. He led the most fractured, argumentative coalition in history, a collection of rivals united only by the fear of slavery. He knew that to march down into the plain was suicide, but to stay on the ridge was a slow death. An army of 100,000 men and camp followers requires 300,000 litres of water every single day just to exist. The sun was their enemy. The dry, hot Etesian winds scoured the moisture from their skin, accelerating dehydration. Every hour they waited, the Greek army grew weaker. Mardonius had no interest in a fair fight. He wanted to break their nerve before the spears even crossed. He unleashed his cavalry, not in a full charge, but in swarms. They were like wasps, riding up to the Greek lines, loosing volleys of arrows that darkened the sky, and then wheeling away before the heavy Greek infantry could touch them. It was a war of harassment, designed to madden and exhaust. Leading these raids was Mecistius, the commander of the Persian cavalry, a man of immense stature and reputation. He rode a Nazian charger with a bridle of solid gold and wore a tunic of Tyrian purple over a cuirass of golden scales. To the Greeks, huddled behind their shields, he looked like a god of war, untouchable and arrogant. But even gods bleed. In a sharp, violent skirmish on the low ground, the Athenians and Megarians managed to isolate the Persian commander. An archer, seeing the golden armour that deflected every blow, aimed not at the man, but at the beast. The arrow struck the horse's flank. The animal reared in agony, throwing Mecistius to the hard-packed earth. He hit the ground with a heavy, metallic crunch. Immediately the Athenians swarmed him. But Mecistius did not die easily. He fought back from the ground, a fallen titan, while Greek spear points sparked and sittered uselessly off his golden scales. It was a moment of panic, the unstoppable man who could not be killed. Until one soldier, realizing the mechanics of the problem, reversed his grip on his spear and drove the spike through the eye slit of the Persian's helmet. The golden commander went limp. The reaction from the Persian camp was a sound that no Greek had ever heard. It was not anger. It was a profound, alien grief. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the plain, the Persian army began to wail. The sound echoed off the mountains, a roar of mourning that shook the air. They shaved their heads. They sheared the manes of their horses and mules. For the Greeks on the ridge, the sound was terrifying proof of the enemy's sheer numbers, a reminder that they were facing a force that mourned with the volume of an ocean. But grief did not stop Mardonius. It sharpened him. He realized he did not need to kill the Greeks with iron, he only needed to take away their water. His cavalry detachments, moving with the speed of smoke, flanked the Greek position and reached the Gargaphia spring. This modest pool of clear water bubbling from the rocks was the lifeblood of the Greek army. The Persians did not drink from it. Instead, they shoveled dirt, rocks, and animal carcasses into the water. They choked the spring, turning the only source of hydration for tens of thousands of men into a muddy, poisoned slurry. The supply lines were cut. The water was gone, the heat was rising. Pausanias stood in his tent, the air thick with the smell of lamp oil and desperation. His generals were arguing, the Athenians demanding action, the Corinthians threatening to leave. The calculus of survival had shifted. To stay was to die of thirst. To attack during the day was to die by arrows. There was only one option left, the most dangerous maneuver in all of warfare, a retreat in the face of the enemy, executed under the cover of darkness. Pausanias made the decision. They would move that night. They would withdraw to a new position called the island, a tract of land nearer to the city of Plataea, where they would have fresh water and the protection of stream beds against the Persian horsemen. The plan was sound: move the centre first, then the wings, in perfect silence. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on August 27th, the friction of war took hold. As the moon rose, casting the ridges into intermittent darkness, the order was given. But plans are paper. War is chaos. The Greek centre, comprised of the smaller city-states, did not just retreat, they broke. Gripped by the terror of the Persian arrows and the exhaustion of the standoff, they didn't stop at the agreed position. They kept walking, marching miles away to the safety of the walls of Plataea, leaving the Spartans and Athenians alone on the ridge. And then, the final absurdity. As Pausanias ordered his own Spartans to move, one of his officers, Amompharetus, refused. He stood before his regent holding a massive rock in both hands. He lifted it high and slammed it into the dirt at Pausanias' feet. With this pebble, he shouted. He cast his vote not to run away from the strangers. He would not bring disgrace upon Sparta. Pausanias stared at him, furious and helpless. The eastern sky was already turning a bruised purple. Dawn was coming. The army was split, the water was poisoned, and his own officers were paralysed by pride. Across the valley, the Persian camp was beginning to stir. The trap was not set for the Persians, it seemed to be closing on the Greeks. As the first light of day breached the horizon, Mardonius mounted his white horse, looked up at the disorganised, retreating Greeks, and smiled. The time for waiting was over. As the sun breached the ridges of Mount Cithaeron on the morning of August 28th, it illuminated a military disaster. To the eyes of Mardonius, watching from the ramparts of his wooden fortress across the river, the Greek army had dissolved. The centre was gone, having fled miles away to the walls of Plataea. The Athenians were a distant cloud of dust on the plain, marching blindly into the morning mist. And there, isolated on the high ground, were the Spartans. They were strung out in a long, ragged column, their backs to the enemy, apparently retreating in panic. Mardonius did not see a tactical withdrawal. He saw a rout. He turned to his officers, a smile of predatory satisfaction breaking across his face. For days he had feared the heavy infantry of the West, but now they looked like frightened sheep. He shouted the order that would doom his empire. They are running. Hunt them down. The Persian advance was not the rhythmic, disciplined march of a drill square. It was a stampede. Mardonius mounted his white charger and spurred it forward, followed by the elite immortals and thousands of other Persian, Mede and Saka troops. They poured out of the gates, splashing across the muddy ford of the Asopus River, screaming insults, eager to catch the Greeks before they could escape. They broke their own formations in their haste, becoming a mob of shouting men rather than an army. They believed the battle was already won. They were wrong. High on the ridge, near the temple of Demeter, Pausanias saw the dust cloud rising from the river. The trap, whether by accident or design, had been sprung. He halted his horse and shouted the command. Instantly, the retreating column of Spartans stopped. In a display of drill that no other army in the world could match, 5,000 men turned as one. They locked their shields. In seconds, the ragged line of refugees transformed into a wall of solid bronze. They were no longer running, they were waiting. The Persian vanguard, breathless from the uphill run, pulled up short. They found themselves staring not at the backs of fleeing cowards, but at the face of the phalanx. But Mardonius's men were veterans. They did not panic. Instead, they deployed their signature tactic. The front ranks slammed their large wicker shields, known as spara, into the dry earth, propping them up to form a continuous, lightweight barricade. Behind this wall, thousands of archers necked their arrows. They did not aim for individual targets, they aimed for the sky. The sound of the arrow storm was like the sudden onset of a hailstorm on a tin roof. Tens of thousands of reed arrows arched over the wicker wall and hammered down onto the Spartan line. This was the moment where the difference in technology became the difference between life and death. The Persian soldier was built for speed and mobility. He wore a tunic of quilted linen, trousers, and a soft felt cap. He carried a short spear and a dagger. He was designed to fight in the vast open deserts of Asia, where he could outmaneuver his enemy and kill from a distance. The Spartan hoplite, by contrast, was a tank of the ancient world. He carried 70 pounds of gear. His shins were encased in bronze greaves. His chest was protected by a bel cuirass of bronze or stiffened linen that could turn a knife stroke. His head was enclosed in a Corinthian helmet, a single sheet of beaten metal that left only a T-shaped slit for the eyes and mouth, reducing his hearing and vision but making him faceless and terrifying. But his most important weapon was the aspis, a 3-foot wide dish of wood faced with bronze, held by a strap and a handle. When the Spartans locked ranks, these shields overlapped, creating a scale armour for the entire unit. Under the rain of arrows, the Spartans did not charge. They stood. Pausanias, standing behind the line, was performing a ritual that to modern eyes seems like madness, but to the ancients was the height of discipline. He was sacrificing a goat. As the arrows clattered against the bronze shields and men groaned as they were struck in the legs or neck, Pausanias examined the liver of the animal. He shook his head. The omens were unfavourable. He refused to give the order to attack. This was the supreme test of Spartan training. To stand motionless while Aaron rains from the sky requires a control over human instinct that is almost unnatural. The Persian archers, emboldened by the Greek passivity, moved their wicker wall closer. They were now within shouting distance, jeering, pouring ire into the ranks. Spartans were dying. The Tegean contingent, allies fighting on the Spartan right, began to waver. They could not understand why they were being forced to die without striking back, but Pausanias waited. He knew that to charge uphill against fresh archers was to exhaust his men before they even reached the enemy. He needed the Persians to commit fully. He needed them to pack themselves so tightly together that their numbers would become a hindrance, not a help. Finally, as the Tegeans began to surge forward without orders, unable to take the punishment any longer, Pausanias looked up from his sacrifice. The Persians were massed directly in front of them, a sea of linen and wicker. The distance was closed. "The omens," he announced calmly, "are good." A single trumpet note cut through the din of the arrow storm. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifyingly mechanical. 5,000 shields were hoisted, 5,000 spears, 8-foot shafts of ash wood tipped with iron, girt in perfect unison. The phalanx, which had been a passive tortoise, became a bristling porcupine. The Spartans took a step forward, then another. They gathered speed, moving not as individuals but as a single multi-legged organism. The ground shook under the rhythmic thud of bronze-shod feet. The Persian archers widened their eyes. They loosed one last desperate volley at point-blank range. But the arrows shattered harmlessly against the advancing wall of bronze. Then physics took over. The Spartans slammed into the wicker shield wall. There was a sickening crunch of wood snapping and bodies colliding. The bronze shield smashed through the flimsy Persian defences like a battering ram through a window. The Spartans did not stop. They stepped on the shattered wicker shields, driving their spears into the linen-clad men behind them with ruthless efficiency. The Persians fought with desperate courage. They dropped their bows and drew their akinakes daggers. They grabbed the Spartan spears with their bare hands, trying to snap the ash shafts to get within striking range. But they were fighting a machine. For every spear they broke, another took its place. The Spartans worked with the grim rhythm of butchers. Shield bash, spear thrust, step, shield bash, spear thrust, step. The immortals, the elite shock troops of the great king, found that their armour was paper against the heavy iron of the Greeks. On the rocky slopes of Cithaeron, there was no room to manoeuvre, no room to retreat. There was only the grinding pressure of the phalanx, pushing the invaders back step by bloody step into the dust. The battle was decided not by tactics, but by the death of a single man. In the crush of the melee, Mardonius, the Persian commander, fought with the desperate courage of a man who knew his gamble had failed. Mounted on his white horse, surrounded by his 1,000 elite guards, he was a beacon for Spartan aggression. He was the head of the snake. A Spartan soldier named Imnestus, seeing the commander above the fray, hurled a stone or perhaps drove a spear that crushed the skull of the Persian general. Mardonius fell, and with him the spirit of the invasion died. Panic is faster than any horse. As the news of Mardonius' death rippled through the lines, the Persian army dissolved. The discipline of the immortals evaporated. The vast host turned their backs and fled, a chaotic stampede of men and animals rushing back across the Asopus River, desperate to reach the perceived safety of their wooden stockade. Only one man kept his head. Artabazus, the Persian second in command, seeing the disaster unfold, took his call of 40,000 men and simply marched away. He did not look back. He left Mardonius' army to the butcher. The Greeks pursued them to the wooden fort. The Spartans, masters of the open field but unskilled in siege warfare, hacked uselessly at the timber walls until the Athenians arrived. The Athenians, the technicians of the alliance, breached the defences. What followed was not a battle, it was an execution. Trapped inside their own fortifications, pressed so tightly together they could barely lift their arms, the Persians were slaughtered. The ancient world did not recognise the concept of prisoner of war camps. Herodotus claims that of the hundreds of thousands who entered that stockade, only 3,000 survived. The ground turned to a slurry of mud and blood. The threat to the west was not just defeated, it was erased. That evening, amidst the silence of the dead, Pausanias walked into the pavilion of Mardonius. It was a tent of shocking opulence, filled with gold basins, embroidered tapestries, and silk hangings, the mobile palace of an eastern satrap. Covered in the dust and gore of the battle, the Spartan regent ordered the Persian cooks to prepare a meal worthy of their dead master. Alongside it, he ordered his own men to prepare a Spartan meal, a black broth of pork and vinegar. Pausanias stood between the two tables, one glittering with the wealth of empire, the other stark and unappetizing. He laughed, calling his generals to witness the absurdity. "Men of Greece," he said, pointing to the gold, "look at the folly of the Mede, who having such fare as this came to rob us of our poverty." To commemorate the victory, the Greeks melted down a tenth of the vast spoils. They forged a monument of bronze, 3 intertwining snakes supporting a golden tripod, inscribed with the names of the 31 city-states that had chosen to fight. They placed it at Delphi, a permanent reminder of the day the impossible odds were overcome. But history rarely grants its heroes a happy ending. Pausanias, the architect of the victory, the man who held the line when the sky rained arrows, was ultimately destroyed by the peace he secured. Drunk on his own success, he was later accused of Medizing, of adopting Persian dress and conspiring with the enemy to rule Greece as a tyrant. The Spartans, ruthless in their laws, turned on him. He fled for sanctuary to the temple of Athena of the Brazen House. Unwilling to violate the sacred ground by dragging him out, the Spartans simply bricked up the doorway. Legend says his own mother laid the first stone. The victor of Plataea starved to death in the dark, a few feet from the freedom he had saved for his people. 2,500 years later, the golden tripod is gone, melted down by later looters. But the twisted bronze body of the serpent column still stands in the hippodrome of Istanbul. It is a jagged scar of metal, a witness to the morning when the fog lifted and the phalanx held. Plataea was not won by the favour of the gods or the inevitability of democracy. It was won by the brutal mechanics of the shield wall, by men who could endure thirst and terror, and by the hard, cold discipline of standing still while death rained from the sky. On that day, the empire broke against the rock of the west, and the echo of that collision shaped the world we live in today.